Money and politics seem to go hand in hand, and in most cases, big money is forcing some out of the political playing field. In his new book, Big Money, political reporter Ken Vogel discusses how big players like the Koch brothers have been making a career out of playing politics with their money. Vogel's book, it was featured in the New York Times book review section over the past weekend, and last month I spoke with Ken about not just his book, but also his look at major donors. There's a lot to cram in here, so I want to get to a few quotes and then you can give some of the context. You know, one of the vocal opponents of Citizens United was obviously President Obama, but in the book, you talk about a closed-door meeting he himself had with some rich donors on the progressive side, including Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, where he said, you now have the potential of 200 people deciding who ends up being elected president every single time. I'm curious, after obviously working the beat that you do for political, but writing the book, do you think his number is actually too high or it's too low?
It is too high, Richard. And in fact, after that, he says, and I quote him saying, in fact, you have 5 or 6 people in this room tonight who could simply write a check and decide who will be, if not the next president of the United States, at least the next major party nominee for their respective party of choice. And then he goes even further to some nervous laughter, stepping towards Bill Gates and says, in fact, Bill, you could just write a check and merely swamp everyone. And Gates is kind of standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking down at his feet, according to my source, awkwardly. But this is true. This is this new stark reality. And it is particularly jarring to hear from President Obama because, as you mentioned, he has been a leading opponent of big money in politics and a leading proponent for reducing the power of big money in politics. To me, as my source recounted this, I'm thinking like, this is kind of a white flag. President Obama, who had this, reducing the role of money in politics, as one of his major issues since the dawn of his political career back in the 90s on the south side of Chicago, is now admitting it's over, the jig is up, big money rules politics.
And Ken, if we got an appetizer of what it looked like in 2012 with a lot of money being spent, and we'll get into a second, maybe not with the results that it was intended, is it just an hors d'oeuvre that we're going to see in 2016, in effect, the money get even bigger and the amount of folks really making the bigger decisions here getting even smaller? Is this just the reality of where we are right now, and the impact probably is going to be better coordinated the next time around with even bigger repercussions for the political system?
Yeah, your analogy is good. 2012 was an appetizer. 2016 is going to be the meal, and it's going to be a huge feast when I'm sort of looking back in this book on 2012 and the what seems like just a shocking reality that Sheldon Adelson, the Las Vegas casino mogul, spent $20 million trying to get Newt Gingrich the GOP presidential nomination. The real question is not why he spent so much, but rather why he spent so little. The guy's worth $40 billion. He could only find $20 million for his favorite presidential candidate. You know, if buying a sports team like Steve Ballmer just did with the Los Angeles Clippers is worth $2 billion for some of these folks, which is what Ballmer is trying to pay for the Clippers, then why wouldn't determining who is the next president be worth $2 billion? And I think it's certainly feasible that we could see folks investing around that sum in the presidential race in 2016.
You mentioned the different types, but you spent a lot of time on the Koch brothers. And what I was surprised to learn from the book was these guys didn't start off as dyed-in-the-wool, conservative, hardline Republicans. They were libertarians. But now, as we've talked about many times in this program, ALEC, for example, and the different agendas they have on the state and federal level, give an idea what you learned through your reporting and through the book. What is their end game? And if they learn lessons from 2012, how do you envision, whether it be in this midterm season or in 16, how they're going to do things differently, and what does their end game really look like, Ken?
I think their end game is moving not just the Republican Party, but American politics as a whole to the right on fiscal issues. And this gets into their libertarian roots, where they don't really care a lot about these social issues that are lightning rods that a lot of people do care about, whether they be abortion or gay marriage. In fact, I talked to David Koch in 2012 on the sidelines of the Republican National Convention. I asked him, what do you think about gay marriage? I support it. And I said, well, that's kind of puzzling because the guy who's about to get the nomination right across the street, who you're supporting, Mitt Romney, he opposes gay marriage. I think he's wrong, David Koch said to me. And David Koch said he would prefer if the Republican Party stayed away from that. Now, clearly, they're not trying to pull the Republican Party away from it. But what they are trying to do is get the Republican Party and American politics as a whole to focus more on the fiscal issues that they care about.
Ken, the public would be shocked. I know you cover this not just for the book, but you do this as a beat. If they understood the boilerplate nature of ALEC, forget a Republican, Democrat, it doesn't make a difference. The idea that an entity basically will write their legislation, hand it to lawmakers and say, sign. And that's going on, as I said, not just in D.C., but across this country. The general public would be surprised as one of the consequences here at Citizens United. We're starting to see this more and more.
Yeah, and I think actually liberals recognize this as a weakness. In other words, that there is this entity that is so effective in the states on the other side, and something of a deficiency for them that they need to compete with. There's certainly more of a focus by liberals on channeling this new big money spending into state-based activism, not only at the electoral level, but at the legislative level.
Last thing, Ken, I got the sense from reading this that you yourself were even surprised by just the scope and the depth of the money here and some of the ambitions attached to it. Are you worried that as people perfect this a little bit more and figure out the best way to get bang for their buck, that we're going to look back and say, what the hell did we do with Citizens United? This perverted a process that was already, dirty to begin with, but this is downright filthy now.
Well, I think that what we're seeing is both sides starting to embrace this much more. And so from the perspective of those who think that this is really eroding democracy, I think it's almost somewhat hopeful that increasingly we're seeing this on all sides. And where I do worry, though, Richard, is the shift and the increasing migration of this money towards non-disclosed routes. So it's one thing to be able to see all this money flowing in. That's going to be harder to do. And I think that is a real challenge for reporters covering it and for voters headed into the voting booth to make their decision as to who they want to support.
Well, again, the book's title is Big Money, and if you like politics and want to know what's really going on behind the curtain, it's a fantastic read, and actually a fun read, too. Ken Vogel, I appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Up next, a look back at the life of a legend. Track star and war veteran Lou Zamperini is gone at the age of 97. We'll have a look at some of his heroic feats. That up after the break.